So I wanted to introduce Armin Rahimi from Washington State University. So Armin is currently a master's student, and so this is his second year working with TRED-C as a master's student, supporting the continuous security monitoring project. Most of his work has been doing a lot of hands-on stuff with our test bed and implementing different techniques and trying to understand how to apply them. So now he's working towards his thesis this semester, and hopefully will be graduating and looking for a job. So if anybody has any good suggestions, you can let us know. So with that, I'll turn it over to Armin, and you can start the talk.
All right. Hey, everyone. So I'm going to be presenting the research we're doing into continuous security monitoring techniques for the energy delivery system here. So the main question we're trying to answer with this research is, what do you monitor? And to answer that question, you need to take two things into consideration. The first thing would be, what kind of data is available to you? That can be network data, packets going in and out of systems. It could be configurations for the systems in your network. It could be events that are happening. Really anything that happens in your network is available data. But what's more important to consider is, how valuable is that data that you have access to? Ideally, you don't want to be monitoring everything, because then you're going to have information overload and you won't really know, or you won't be able to handle all the information that you're monitoring and storing. So distinguishing between what data is valuable and what isn't will also help you reduce the possibility of false negatives and false positives, as well as help you manage the sheer volume of your data better. So there are a lot of companies out there that currently do monitoring technologies. You can see a list of them here. And I chose a few of the standouts on the bottom to elaborate on. So for instance, Cydex, they use artificial intelligence to enhance their detection capabilities. Or Veracity Industrial Networks, they use security zone creation, which I think is a pretty interesting concept. But what's key here is that a lot of these companies, they only focus on just monitoring and gathering data. They don't really consider, how do we decide on what's important and what should we be monitoring. So that's the question we're trying to answer here. So in order to decide on what to monitor, you need to have these three steps, this three-step approach. The first one is to identify feasible system attack paths. So how will an attacker get into your system, and once they get in, what paths do they have to get into different nodes? And to do this, we're using in this research the MITRE attack-based tactic and techniques. And I'll elaborate on what that is later. But it's essentially a database of different sort of attack techniques that you can use. The second stage is to determine the coverage of attack monitoring capabilities. So what are you actually monitoring in your system? You need to know the coverage of your system, what nodes in your system are being monitored, and what sort of data you're gathering from those nodes. And then the last point to consider would be to develop a system-level coverage metrics. So essentially what you do there is you pretty much assign a numeric value to how well you think your system is monitored, based on the different paths that the attacker can take in your network. So the first thing to do is to decide on what mechanisms should you use to monitor your network. So if you're only looking to monitor maybe network traffic, then maybe you only want to use NetFlow from the switches in your network. Or if you want to elaborate on that a little bit, you might use IDS reports. So IDS, in addition to giving you the flows, it also does maybe deep packet scanning and give you exactly what's inside the payloads. Or if you want to move to a more host-based monitoring technique, you might use Windows logs, which will give you access to authentications that are happening on your systems, whether they're local authentications, remote, are they successful, are they failures, who's actually trying to do them, as well as access to any processes that are being created or destroyed in your systems. If you want to have a more real-time approach to your monitoring, maybe use something like an antivirus, which can also give you insight into what files in your system, what important files in your system are getting written to or are being read currently. And also, obviously, you have to focus on the power system aspect of it as well. We're not really focusing on that very heavily yet, but that's definitely to come. So to make your system model, what you have to do is you have to consider the configuration of all the nodes in your network. And this is really something that you should already be able to do fairly easily, considering the NIST standards that are given to us. You know, what is running on your nodes, how is it operating, what sort of traffic are you supposed to see from that node, and so on. So really any sort of data related to your nodes. Then you have to consider your monitoring capabilities. What are you going to use to monitor your network? Are you only going to do network traffic, or are you going to do events and IDS reports, or maybe even expand beyond that? And then, as I said, you have to consider the different attack techniques that an adversary might be using to gain access into your network, and how that attack would look in your network in the context of those events that you're seeing through your monitoring infrastructure. So to develop your monitoring strategy, first you have to consider your system. So on the left, that's just like a brief example of our testbed here, where we have the DMS, HMI, the gateways, relays. So what you do is you break your system down into a network graph, essentially, of your system. And what's important here is to recognize the entry point for the attacker. So for our system, for example, the yellow circle there, that would be the attacker, and the two firewalls are the only way an attacker can get into our network. So once you identify that, then you can very efficiently understand how the attacker would be traversing your system. So once you've developed your system model, you have to decide on a monitoring strategy. And the idea is that you have access to a certain set of different monitoring techniques, like net flows, IDS, and event logs, and each one of those will be giving you different features to monitor for. So for instance, net flows will give you source and destination address, the ports being used, what the size of the packet is, or if you're using an IDS like Bro, that will give you what the payload is and what application is being used to send that traffic over the network in addition to its source and destination. So you can see, like, an example would be you would maybe monitor your firewalls using Bro. You'd use, obviously, NetFlows to monitor the traffic going through your switches, and then you would use event logs on your DMS, HMI, and gateway, since they're all Windows-based systems. So this here is the MITRE attack database. Attack stands for Adversarial Tactics, Techniques, and Common Knowledge. So each column here that you see is a different attack technique that can be used on your system. So you have things like lateral movement, privilege escalation, execution, disruption. And each row would be a specific tactic that an attacker can use. So for instance, for privilege escalation, they might be using web shell, or for discovery, they might be using account enumeration, and so on. So we use this database in this research, and specifically we focus on privilege escalation, lateral movement, and execution, and I'll get into why we chose those three specifically later. But we also use the attack database in conjunction with the CARS. So CARS is the Cyber Analytics Repository. The attack database essentially gives you a very general overview of how to monitor for certain types of attacks and how to mitigate them, whereas CARS will give you specific examples of how to identify the threats that you're looking for. So an example down at the bottom would be system logs that you would see for a remote desktop logon. So if you see something like that in your Windows logs that you're getting, if the event code is 4624 and all the other information matches, then you can be sure that the remote desktop logon has occurred. So if you use this in conjunction with the attack database, it gives you a stronger understanding of what exactly you're looking for and how to identify malicious activity. So to identify what sort of attack techniques you want to be monitoring for, you have to consider the different attack phases that happen. So on the left, you have the list of all the tactics that are in the MITRE attack database. In the middle, you'll see the attack phases. So an adversary would usually go through, well, will always pretty much go through discovery, lateral movement, and privilege escalation. And that's sort of a loop that they might go through over and over again. You know, once they do discovery, they might do privilege escalation, and then do lateral movements, and then seek further privilege escalation. So having one or all of those in the set of attack techniques that you're monitoring for would definitely increase your likelihood of detecting somebody in your network. So the reason that we decided to use privilege escalation specifically in our research is because pretty much, or lateral movement rather, is pretty much any attack that happens on your network will be using lateral movement. So that'll increase, again, the likelihood of us discovering any attacks that might happen. So after you've decided on what sort of attacks you're trying to monitor for, then you have to come up with a way of assigning scores to your nodes, or weights, in other words. So the way you do this is you go through all the nodes in your network, and for every single node, you consider all the techniques it is vulnerable to. You know, if the technique matches the feature sets that you're monitoring for on your node, then what you do is you calculate the probability of seeing events that your monitoring infrastructure will report to you. So what is the probability of seeing those events happen on that node given a specific time frame? You assign that probability score to that node for that specific attack. And if the attack never happens, if you never see any sort of traffic that would indicate an attack, then the score for that node for that specific attack would be 0. After you've assigned these probability numbers, you have to normalize all the probability numbers for each node across all the different tactics that it's vulnerable to. And I'll give an example of this to make it more clear on what exactly I'm saying. So once you've assigned all the probability numbers to the nodes in your network, then you're going to end up with something like this, where each node has a weight associated with it. And the way these weights work, the higher the number is, the less likely it is for you to successfully detect a malicious activity. And that's because the higher the number is, it means the more data you're gathering from that system, and the more data is going through that system. So it kind of becomes too crowded for you to be able to very efficiently decide on what is happening. So you can see, for instance, in our network, the top portion that you see, pretty much only the HMI is being monitored. So that's a very poorly monitored section of our network. Whereas the bottom portion, where we have the gateway, the switch, and all the relays, well, we're monitoring everything in that section. So that would be a well-monitored path. So our testbed here, I'm just going to give a brief overview of what our testbed is and what we're collecting. So we have the control center there with the DMS and the HMI, which is connected to our substation through a couple of firewalls. The substation has the gateway for the relays and a switch that connects all the relays and gateways together. So what we're doing is we're gathering some data related to system logs, Windows event logs from the DMS, HMI, and the gateway. We're getting bro reports from all the traffic that goes through the switch. We're monitoring the relay configuration for any changes that might happen. We're getting net flow reports from this switch and also snort reports. So these would be the set of set of features that we decided would be important enough for our network to monitor. So once we collect all of this data, then we feed it into the ELK stack. And ELK stack is comprised of Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana. Logstash would be the tool you use to convert the data into a format that Elasticsearch can use. Elasticsearch then would be your database. It's where all your data is going to be stored in indices, separate indices. And Kibana is sort of the visualization tool you use to see what data you have stored in your test bed. So the data that we gathered for the purposes of this experiment, it was over a 1-month time period, specifically December of last year. All the data that we gathered was just day-to-day normal network usage. We didn't really isolate the system to make perfect data. So we got about 6.2 million data points in total across all the different things we're monitoring for. So NetFlows accounted for about 1.5 million of that. Bro was by far the vast majority of it, with almost 4.6 million, and that's because Bro pretty much monitors everything that we have in our traffic, in our network, any DNS traffic, FTP, HTTP, any certificates that are being used, the applications that are being used to send traffic over our network. All of these Bro will report to us. And then we also have the Windows logs that are coming in from the HMI and the gateway systems. For Windows logs, we're specifically monitoring for system events, application security, and any PowerShell commands that are being run. And we added PowerShell specifically because a lot of the attacks in the MITRE attack database had PowerShell as one of its detection mechanisms. If you know what's being run in the PowerShell, then you have a better chance of knowing if an attack is happening. So we took all the data and we comprised it into these tables here. And as I said before, we used privilege escalation, lateral movements, and execution. So what you see here is every column that you see is a different attack tactic that can be used. Any one of the, and then on the left-hand side, we have all the nodes in our network. So we have the HMI, the switch, the gateway, and I sort of compacted all the relays together because there's 8 of them, and that would be too big for the table. So anything that has NA listed, that is something that we cannot monitor or we cannot detect given our current monitoring capabilities. Anything that has 0, that means that we can monitor or we can detect an attack of that type, but given our time frame, we were not able to detect anything that pertained to that specific attack. And all the numbers that are not 0 and not NA, those are the probability calculation of seeing an event that could indicate that attack type given our 30-day period. So one thing to point out here is that this is some of these attack types are fairly broad in their detection methods. So for instance, in lateral movements, when you have exploitation of vulnerability, what we're monitoring for essentially is process crashes, because that would be one indication of an exploitation of vulnerability. But there are so many indications for that that we're not really accounting for all of them. So that would be kind of something to expand on in the future, is developing a more specified method of going about doing this. So this will be the third table for execution. You see that we can only detect 3 types of attacks, and, well, none of them happen. One thing I should point out is in the lateral movement table, as you can see, we can detect more attacks in lateral movements than any of the other 2 tables, and that's a good thing because, as pointed out before, lateral movement is a common portion of detecting attacks. So after we have these probability numbers for each node based on the different attack type, we have to normalize all of it using L2 normalization. And the reason is, if you look at the HMI here on the privilege escalation and the lateral movement tables, you'll see that HMI has 3 different scores assigned to it. That would be the first row for the nodes. So it has a 44.1 for web shell, a 25.15 for application deployment software, and an 88.5 for remote desktop protocol. So you have to unify these three different probability measurements into one measurement that you can then assign as weight to that node within your graph. So after we've done the normalization, those are the values we see for the different nodes in our network, and the relays are 0 because we never detected any events happening for the relays. And the switch, its value is higher than the other ones because it had more data going through it than any other node in our network, obviously, its switch. So after we gather all that data, this is what we end up with. So that would be a graph of our network, and we have all the weights associated with the different nodes listed next to them. So then what you want to do is you want to do shortest path analysis on your network from the attacker, which would be the yellow node, to all the different nodes in your network, essentially telling you what is the optimal way for the attacker to get from where they are to each and every single node in your network. So I have listed on the right-hand side some of the different ways the attacker can go about getting to the gateway, for instance. You can see the gateway would be the most costly of all the different paths it could take. But then the gateway itself has two different paths. The attacker could go through switch 1 and HMI and then remote into the gateway, or go through switch 2. And what we see is that this is the path for the for going up to the HMI and getting into the gateway, because that path has less resistance for the attacker. So one thing to mention is that this is not a strongly monitored network. Again, as I pointed out before, the top portion is not very well monitored, for instance, switch 1. So an example of shortest path, which I actually mentioned before, so we can move on. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done on this project. So shortest path calculations can give you a good estimate of what to look for, but maybe we can find better ways of detecting how efficiently our network is being monitored, maybe through resistance distance or things like that. That's something to look into. Another thing to do would be to improve our methodology for detection. As I mentioned before, a lot of the attacks that you saw on that table for the MITRE attack database, they have very broad detection specifications. So a good thing to do would be to kind of narrow that category down. We also want to implement more of the attacks that we can monitor in the MITRE attack list, because we can't really monitor many of them. But I think expanding that would be a good idea. One thing to do would be to automate the creation of that graph, the graph of your network. So in case, if your network is constantly changing, if nodes are going up and down all the time, then that can be done for you automatically. And also sort of try to come up with a methodology of what to do once an attacker has breached your network. How does that change the scoring for all your nodes? And that's it. Questions?
Hello, this is David. I've got a question. At one point when you were talking about the development of the graph model, you said something, I guess it was an assumption that the attacker's only point of entry would be through the firewall.
Yes.
How does that, how do you account for things like stolen credentials that would come through the firewall but would look okay? And how would you account for insider attacks? Say if someone came in with something nasty on a USB stick and put it in somewhere on the inside of the network?
Well, those are actually very good points. We're not currently accounting for either of those, but that would be something we could look into later. That would be harder to do because if the attack is coming from the inside, then it's harder to sort of well, even detected really, because you presumably trust everyone in your network, but apparently not.
A reminder to folks online that you are muted. You need to take yourself off mute if you have a question.
I have a question. So you showed a list of attacks, like database MITRE. How many of those have you tried on this network?
Oh, so we haven't really done any purposeful malicious activity for getting these numbers. The idea is that, for instance, for remote desktop protocol attacks, maybe RDP is just something that normally happens in your network all the time. But the point is that it could potentially, one of those times, it could be malicious. So you have to take into account the malicious and the non-malicious traffic that happens in your network. But having said that, we do the demo of the sort of the Ukraine-style attack in our network quite often, and I think one of those demo scenarios was in this data set that we used for this report.
Do you have the recap for that from the demo, which you could share?
Yeah, we can share all the details on how to do the attack with you if you're interested in that.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe demonstrate that.
Yeah, I think we've demonstrated that before in the past for Betsy.
Any other questions online? Questions in the room? Thank the speaker.